This is my summary video log of my article from my scavenger hunt, Money in the Bank, Feeling Powerful Increases Savings. I particularly chose this article personally just because of my interest in saving habits of various communities around the world. And I realized that um, there probably must be some level of overlap between communication and business on this point, based upon the consistent challenge of the habit of savings across the world. And this particular article, which was based out of Stanford University, um, to me just provided a very fascinating and compelling connection between consumer behavior, psychology, and communication at the same time. As the authors begin the introduction of their article, they essentially begin to talk about how money and um, and power have overlapped, but they begin to just discuss power and then how money can provide a sense of power by possessing it. And they quote various scholars to kind of support that particular perspective. Next, they kind of go into a conceptual background, and this is here they're trying to build the concepts of power as denoted in a lot of psychological journals and articles, as well as the Journal of Consumer Behavior. And this begins to connect the idea of time into the element of the feeling of power and into money. Um, it's been established in their introduction that money is associated um, with the feeling of power, but then as they develop this concept of power a little bit further, it's discovered that the feeling of power leads one to have an overlap between their perception of their present self and their future self. And that overlap is an issue of time versus an individual who lacks a feeling of power or feels powerless tends to dissociate themselves from their future self because they want their life to be different in the future. So it's almost like a different them. And that concept is what gives them the basis to say, well then, if an increased feeling of power, if power is a psychological state of mind that can be manipulated, and if you can manipulate a person to feel power, then what that feeling of power will lead them to see themselves present and their future self as that which overlaps, and therefore they want to maintain that. And that was something else that they also noted in the conceptual background. They came up with four hypotheses, probably more than four, but they kind of divide them based on the different controls that can happen on this habit of increasing your desire to save money and its connection to power. So first of all, they deal with the very fundamental premise of their research, which is that those made to feel powerful will save more money relative to those made to feel powerless, and those not exposed to a power prime. And so their first thing is just comparatively, this group will save more money. That's their first hypothesis. It's not that the second group will save no money, but they just will not save as much money. And pretty much they kind of establish how they think the design of the experiment, which they primarily use the concept of a chair that's kind of, the research assistant is kind of sitting on a lower chair, and they're sitting on a higher chair that's more elevated, and that particular difference should provide a sense of power to the individual that's being researched, and that particular feeling of power will lead them to save more money, or at least to have the desire to save relative. They then begin to amend this by essentially saying that people who feel powerful will save more than individuals who feel powerless if the reason is to keep money to secure one's current state. So because the feeling of power creates an overlap between our present and future self, then if the reason to save is to keep money to secure one's current state, then the hypothesis is that the person who feels more powerful will do that. But also, individuals who feel powerless will save more than individuals who feel powerful if the reason to save is to spend money on a status-related product. So a person who feels powerful, they wouldn't spend money on a status related to appear for status. They just want to maintain their current sense of power. But if a powerless individual is actually going to have a greater incentive to save money if the goal is to spend rather than to maintain or to secure your feeling of power. They go on to now moderate this even further and to say the effect of the feeling of power can also be moderated by how secure you feel that your power is. And then also the effect of feeling powerful on saving will be moderated by whether money is the resource needed to maintain the power. So how secure your power is, and even in another way of saying that is money even the thing that you need to maintain power? And they eventually will go into the article to talk about how a Harvard research study noticed that 84% of participants actually associated the word knowledge with power. And so sometimes it's not money that's needed, but it may be knowledge. And their fourth hypothesis was that when saving money can aid in maintaining power, the effect of feeling powerful and saving will be mediated by the desire to maintain one's current state. So to me, the last three hypotheses are really more about how the effect can be mediated, that psychological effect can be mediated. And so this one deals with the desire. Do you even want to maintain your current state? Maybe a person might be unhappy. They break it down into multiple studies, and each of these studies is appropriate to their, to the relative hypothesis. In the first study, it's primarily about the elevated chair. And again, this person's likelihood to save money when they're sitting on a higher chair versus a person sitting on a lower chair. Through the second study, you find the second study continues to build off of the first study with slight modifications in the experimentation, the participants, which they give you the overview of the design of the experiment as well as the participants that participated. They then move to an incentive where they offer the research participants they can either take the money to spend the money, or they can take the money to keep it and save it at the actual office. And so they wanted to, again, connect this to, again, a person sitting in a higher seat and a lower seat. And the fourth, as well as the fifth study, continue to build off of that, the individual's desire to save. And so they try to find metrics to measure that person's desire to save, as well as how secure they feel their power is. If they're, let's say, switching from one chair to the other, you might sit on a high chair for a while and then they have to switch, et cetera, et cetera. They then move to a general discussion about the again, the ideas of research surrounding this, and the opportunities for exploration and for expansion, and their kind of general findings that they found that their hypotheses, all of them pretty much proved to be true, and were demonstrated through the various experiments. They then began to talk about the theoretical contributions that it brought to the idea of the relationship of power, the feeling of power, and saving money, and how it can affect consumer habits. And some of the practical contributions was obviously very specific in impacting the thought process as well as the decisions of actual individuals that handle money and their savings habits. And they believe that pretty much if we can tailor the way that we present savings, if we banks or other financial institutions that may have a very powerful incentive to encourage people to save, that it really should involve some means of being able to create a sense of power and inspiring people to want to desire to maintain that. And this is also where the study for Harvard came up, where it was discussed that they did a study to see what people would associate with the word power, and they chose different words, and 84% of the participants chose knowledge more than anything else. And so people actually equate power more with knowledge than with money. And so obviously there could be potential future research to also show a connection between the desire to learn and education. And so this is where they kind of give their caveats and calls for future research and ways by which the experiment may not necessarily be appropriate. For example, sitting on a higher chair, how do you kind of do that, let's say, outside of that kind of experiment, that the feeling of power, feeling powerful can be instigated by various things. They kind of end the article by just discussing where the data was collected and which authors collected that data and where was the location and what was the date and the time of that. And overall, I think the article was pretty well thoroughly written. I thought it was well thought out, and I think it provides a substantial contribution to this overlap of communication in business and consumer behavior.